Thank you for joining us today on Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lewis Miller. The mission of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics is to stimulate thought, expand consciousness, and encourage community. I say encourage community because I believe that the vast majority of we humans are friendly tribal animals. And when we live in small enough communities in which we know each person by name or at minimum by face, we are collaborative enough to sustain everyone with the bare essentials of nutritious food, warm shelter, health care, and education provided with dignity, respect, kindness, and love. Today, we're bringing you another in our series called Confessions of the Psychedelic Elders. In this series, prominent people in the sciences and arts are going to reveal to you, our listeners, and the world, details of their courageous sub rosa self-experimentation with psychedelics over the past decades. The purpose of the series is to counter the decades of disinformation about psychedelics and inform the world that prominent, good citizens, contributory citizens, patriots, solid fathers and mothers have risked their careers and their very livelihoods in order to learn from psychedelics and to advance science. This week, my guest is my dear friend and colleague, the world-renowned ethnopharmacologist, Dr. Dennis McKenna. Dennis has conducted research in ethnopharmacology for over 40 years. He's a founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute and was a key investigator in the WASCA project, the first biomedical investigation of ayahuasca. He's the younger brother of Terence McKenna, who many of you are familiar with. From 2000 to 2017, Dennis taught courses on ethnopharmacology at the University of Minnesota. In the spring of 2019, in collaboration with colleagues in Canada and the United States, Dennis incorporated a new nonprofit, the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Dennis.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see you after all these years. I think it must have been 2014 or something.
Oh my gosh, it went by that fast.
Longer than I care to think about, but yes, you're looking well, you're thriving, I can tell.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Very good to see you.
I'm a psychedelic elder, as you are.
Sadly, yes, we are. I guess that's a mantle that we have to take now. You know, people have said I'm a psychedelic elder. People have said I'm a legend. I think these are all preparatory to saying I'm totally irrelevant.
Oh,
you know? I mean,
my God.
The world moves on and leaves us geezers kind of in the dust and wondering. You know, I think probably neither you nor I ever thought that we would reach this place where we're seeing the changes that we're seeing now in the sort of public sphere of interest in psychedelics. You know, I mean, it's a true renaissance.
It's a true renaissance. Talking about age, I'm 82 now, Dennis. How old are you?
Oh, I'm a youngster compared to you, Richard. In that case, I feel so much better. I just turned 70 last December.
Well, that's true. You are a youngster for me. I can hardly remember back that far. And by way of background, are you presently living with somebody?
Yes, I live with my wife, Sheila, who is we've been together 40 years.
Oh, my word.
And we're still talking to each other most of the time. And we've been very lucky. She's my anchor in lots of ways. She's not this crazy psychedelic hippie chick or anything like that. She's a very grounded person. And conveniently enough for me, she happens to be Canadian, which I met her in graduate school when I was doing my PhD at UBC back in the early 80s. And we've been together since then. And because she's Canadian, I get to move up to Canada, and I'm now officially recognized permanent resident of Canada in good standing, more or less, at least until they catch up with who I really am. But
whereabouts in Canada are you, Dennis?
British Columbia, little town called Abbotsford.
Yes.
Not so little, actually. About 100,000 people.
Oh,
but
my!
It's about you know the place?
No, but 100,000 isn't little to me. I live in a town of 7,000.
Well, there you are. Yeah, it's compared to Vancouver, I guess it's little.
Mm-hmm.
It's about an hour east of Vancouver, and about as close as we could get when we moved up here to find a place we could afford. But it's worked out. We're happy to be here. It's a nice, quiet little town. Not a whole lot happens here, which is the way I like it, except the occasional gang killing and that sort of thing. But I guess that's everywhere these days. So yeah, we're in Abbotsford now, after being in Minnesota since 1992. We moved there the end of 1992.
I'm going to ask you about the gangs, and I'm going to ask you about something else as well after we do the initial part of the confessions interview. But for now, I'm going to continue with the confessions, but I do have two burning questions I'm going to ask you later.
Okay.
By way of background, by the way, I'm going to take a side note here. You're married for 40 years, right from the hip, blink without thinking. What are three things that have contributed to the longevity of your marriage?
Tolerance.
Yes.
Basic respect for each other.
Yes.
And affection.
Tolerance, respect, and affection. Tolerance, respect, and affection.
And I guess by that I mean, we are soulmates in a certain way, even though it's something that we've discovered over 40 years of marriage, and even though we have diverse interests, we also have complementary interests. So that helps, and I think maybe the secret to a good marriage is that your partner needs to be also your best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that Sheila is my best friend. I trust her. I hope that she trusts me. She knows I'm a crazy guy, a wacko, and all that, but she tolerates it, and she doesn't have to participate in it to appreciate it.
Dennis, were you brought up with religion?
Yes, I was raised in a Catholic church, and I'm still recovering. I don't think you ever get free from that. But yes, I think of myself as a recovering Catholic.
Uh-huh.
I rejected all of that years ago, but it changes your world. It twists you, Richard, to grow up in a religion like that. So I'm still probably dealing with the trauma of being a good Catholic back when I was a kid. And I was into it. I mean, I bought into it. I was an altar boy with all that comes with that. And I took it very seriously at the time. But then I sort of, around the threshold of adolescence, began to realize that a lot of this just doesn't make any sense on any level. So I rejected it. And of course, my brother, being 4 years ahead of me, kind of led the charge in that respect. We both rejected the church, but I've never looked back. I don't regret it at all.
What is your
and so I have that trauma to deal with, and probably always will.
What is your present conception of what's called God?
Well, on one hand, I'm a reductionist scientist, but on the other hand, I'm also a mystic in a certain sense, and I don't think you can be familiar with psychedelic substances without realizing that there's a whole lot we don't understand, and science is a good tool to try to expand the boundaries of our understanding, but it's also inherently flawed because it's limited. It's limited to what we can see, what we can measure and quantify. There's a lot more going on than just that, I think, in being. But I believe that consciousness is a fundamental property of nature. I think it's built into nature at the most fundamental levels. So if I were anything, if I were any kind of religious person, I'd have to say I'm kind of an animist. My worldview is closer to indigenous worldviews where consciousness is in everything. From, I think, the most fundamental levels of existence, the subatomic, even the quantum level on up. I think that it's built into the nature of reality. So that's my conception of God, that it's not something separate from us. We're part of it. And if anything, if I had to, glibly say what I think God is, I think God is the universe waking up to itself, becoming conscious of itself. At least that's what I'd like to think.
Thank you. Yes, God and everything. It sounds very Spinoza-ish, pantheistic. You used the word describing yourself as a reductionist scientist. Tell our listeners what you mean when you say a reductionist scientist.
Well, first of all, let me say, science by its very nature sort of demands reductionism. That's the premise. Reductionism is when you postulate that if you can't measure it, if you can't see it, if you can't quantify it, it's a way of relating to the physical world in a tangible way, and it's a consequence of that old Cartesian dualism that really split off the world of matter, the world of phenomena, from the world of consciousness. But it's an artificial split, But so I am. When I put my scientist hat on, then I'm a reductionist, But I also wear that hat provisionally, knowing that science is a good tool, but not by any means the whole story. There are other ways of knowing that science doesn't really encompass. But, as a sort of a tool, a platform from which to ask questions of nature and get answers back that are more or less verifiable within limits, I think science is very useful. But I think science has to be practiced from the perspective that inherently it's always going to furnish an incomplete picture of the nature of reality. That the holy grail of science is to, come up with a theory of everything, so-called theory of everything. At least in physics, that's the goal. I don't know if that's inherently possible, but it's it in fact is not achievable based on what we know now, because it leaves out so many aspects of what we know to be existence just from our own individual subjective experience. Science has no way to measure many of these things or quantify many of these things. I mean, maybe it will someday, but right now we're not there.
How old were you when you had your first experience with mind-altering substance?
Well, I guess depends on what the substance is and what you want to call it. My first experience with mind-altering substances was with cannabis, and it would have been, I was 15 years old, so it would have been 1966. And again, that's because of my brother. He was a student at Berkeley at the time, and used to come back to Paonia, Colorado, this little podunk town in western Colorado where we grew up. And I was still stuck there, but he came back one summer, the summer of 2016, and had some cannabis, and so that's when I was introduced to cannabis. He brought his new cute Jewish girlfriend, and he spent 2 or 3 weeks here. And in those days, it's interesting, nobody knew about any of this stuff, certainly not in Paonia. We just went across the street from my house, which was the city park. The city park was across the street from where I lived in Paonia. And we went over there and we spread out a blanket and broke out some beverages, and he broke out a pipe, and we lit up and started toking, all in plain sight, figuring nobody would know what we were doing anyway, or not that they would even care, probably. So that was my first experience, and actually it took it took several exposures under those circumstances for me to actually feel anything. But on the third or fourth time, I began to sort of get it. Oh, this is what it's about. This is what it's supposed to be like. And so it was cannabis was my first encounter. And then a year later, in 1967, I went to Berkeley. It was the summer of love. Yeah, we were all into the countercultural thing then. And for some reason, my father gave me permission to go to Berkeley and spend part of the summer with Terrence, who was living there at the time, right in the middle of all this countercultural ferment. I have no idea what possessed my father to let me do this, because he was highly disapproving of all that, especially anything having to do with drugs. But for some reason, he gave me permission to go out with a friend and spend the summer of love in Berkeley and San Francisco. Maybe, I have no idea. Maybe he was living through me vicariously or something. But anyway, so that summer, I had my first LSD experience in Berkeley, and Tilden Park, if you happen to know where that is.
I do know where it is. I know Tilden Park, and I would like to hear now about your first LSD experience.
You're asking me a lot. You think I recall my first LSD experience, Richard? You're giving me a lot of credit.
Okay. Well, if you don't, then take us to the next experience.
No, I do recall it. I recall it. It was interesting. It was just my friend and I, my very close friend from high school friend. Both of us kind of the rebels of our class in a certain way. Well, we scored some acid on the street on Telegraph Avenue. We ran into this crazy-looking, long-haired, wild-eyed person who was selling acid. And I said, "Oh yeah, man, this is really good stuff, really good shit," And he sold us what amounted to an aspirin, with a little purple dot in the center of it. I remember this very well, a little purple dot, and we took it, and he was as good as his word. It was quite full, quite a sufficient dose. And I don't know what we expected from the thing, whether hallucinations or mystical insights or, that kind of thing. What we got was kind of a phylogenetic regression, in a sense. We returned to our primate, we reconnected with our primate selves. We were like monkeys, literally, up in the woods, not sitting quietly in meditation, but climbing trees and howling and beating our chests and carried on. It was probably a good thing we were not close to any civilized or decent people at that time. But that was what it was, kind of. It was very much a regression to, a state of pre-human state, at least in our perception. That was one aspect of it. But LSD trips are long, and but that's what I remember from it mostly, was how anomalous it was, how it was not at all what I thought it was going to be. That was the thing. It was this other experience, but nonetheless, very, very good, very positive.
Was it positive enough that after the experience you thought to yourself, I'm going to do this again?
Oh yeah, there was no question about it.
No question about it. Well,
certainly, it was a revelation, and as you know, and so I acted on that. I mean, it was my threshold in my crossing the threshold into the experience of a real psychedelic. I don't consider cannabis a real psychedelic. It has its virtues, but it's not a true psychedelic in the way I think of it. Yeah, it was extremely positive, and one of the things that kind of set me on this path. I had never taken DMT at the time, and Terence was quite interested in DMT and actually had DMT, which was not easy to find in those days, but he had it, and he thought it was much more profound and interesting than LSD. I did not take it that summer, however, but I took some back with me to Paonia, and eventually, a few months after that, we had a group of friends in Paonia, kind of I guess these days we would have been called nerds, or, just a group of kind of odd kids that were into weird stuff like psychedelics, science fiction, and so on. We used to go up to this campground in a valley close to the town called Hubbard Creek, relatively isolated. That's where we went to do our, to take our drugs. And that's when I did DMT, was up there. And that was even more of a revelation. I mean, that DMT, I think, more than LSD, was a catalyst for both me and Terence to kind of dedicate our lives to this, because it was so profound and so utterly unlike anything we'd experienced, and we were interested in the anomalous. We were interested in crazy stuff. We were steeped in science fiction, and with its notions of things like extra-dimensional travel, that kind of thing. So psychedelics fit right into that. It was really, that was the basis of our fascination with psychedelics, rather than a spiritual quest for enlightenment. It wasn't really that for us. It was more the idea that psychedelics were a way to access other dimensions. That's how we conceptualized it. And perhaps it was, perhaps it is. But, it's all these things. As you know, Richard, the psychedelic experience is, so complex. It can conform itself to whatever vessel you put it into. Whatever conceptual lens you want to apply, it will, you can perceive it through these different points of view. But that's what got me started.
Well, I am well aware, as you know I am, of your life history, and we've talked before on this program. One time we talked about some of your life history, and we talked about the book that you wrote, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, about your adventures with your brother. But that was 6 years ago, and a lot of our listeners do not know your life history. And so I would like you to take us now on a journey. Please take us on a journey that started in Berkeley with that LSD experience. It continued with the DMT that Terence gave you that you brought back to Colorado. And now please take us on a journey of your life and experimentation as best you can. And try to be, this is a tough question, I know it, but and try to be chronological if you can.
All right. Well, how much time do we have?
This is now internet, Dennis. So whereas in the past we would tie down to 1 hour on the radio, we now have more time, so we can go on.
Okay. All right. Well, so I had that LSD experience in Berkeley, and I was, I think, 67. I was just going into my junior year in high school at that time, and but I realized as a result of that LSD experience that this is what I wanted to pursue in some way. I wanted to, as I've often said in my talks, the DMT, to Terence and me, it wasn't simply the most interesting drug we'd ever taken. And in fact, our experience with drugs had been rather limited, but it was the most interesting thing we ever had encountered. It just seemed far more interesting than anything else in our universe. And in some ways, 50 years later, I can almost say that really hasn't changed in some way. I think psychedelics as a group are one of the most interesting areas to pursue if you're looking for answers. And as a naturally curious person, I was. So after that, I went back. I completed high school. And in 1968, two interesting books came up on my radar. One of them my brother gave to me for my 18th birthday. It was the first edition of the Teachings of Don Juan. And of course, we know now that the Teachings of Don Juan and a lot of what Castaneda published was probably made up. But it doesn't really matter because at the time I didn't know that. And that Teachings of Don Juan sort of woke me up to the fact that there was an ethnographic, historical, cultural aspects to psychedelics, that these were nothing new, that the 60s excitement about psychedelics was more or less linked to Timothy Leary and the cultural ferment of the time, but they had a cultural history of thousands of years. And so that woke me up to that. And at the same time, the same summer or around the same time, another book came across my desk somehow, and it was called The Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And it was the proceedings of a symposium that was sponsored by NIMH, of all institutions in San Francisco in 1967. And it was the proceedings of this closed symposium that came up on my radar. And I read that book, and it became very important to me. So this book was, and this happens to be a mint-condition copy. I've got a much older, much more tattered one.
A little closer to the camera, Dennis, and down, right there, a little higher. Yes, I think, okay, now we can see it. Okay.
Right. So for the U.S. government to put this out was amazing, because this had all the leading lights of Schultes and Shulgin, Andrew Weil, all of these high-profile individuals had contributed to this symposium, which was a closed affair, and the only thing the taxpayers ever got from it was this book. Somehow or other, this book fell into my hands, and I read it from cover to cover, and I was quite excited by it. And why I'm going on at such length about this is that it was the other side, the other leaf of the other page. If on the other hand, on one hand, you had Castaneda, the teachings of Don Juan, and that whole sort of window into the ethnographic side of psychedelics. This other was the scientific side, and I realized, with a big emphasis on botany and chemistry and that kind of thing, and these things seemed very complementary to me. I realized that, I guess, a revelation that came out of this was that, hey, there's real science here. There's actually a body of knowledge around these. The study of these things, and a discipline called ethnopharmacology. And maybe I should be an ethnopharmacologist. It seemed to open the door to the fact that maybe this would be my career path. So, and in my teenage 18-year-old brain, I was thinking, hey, I can get paid to get stoned. I mean, that was probably that naive. But as a result of those books, I went, when I started as a freshman in undergraduate at the University of Colorado in 1969, that affected what I took. That affected my courses. I took courses. There was no such thing as an ethnobotany major at that time. Nobody knew about ethnobotany. So I took a lot of anthropology, particularly comparative religions, and chemistry, botany, all of those things related to that, to kind of forge my own major in ethnopharmacology. So that was the basis of my undergraduate work. But then, as you know, and everybody who knows Terence and my story, in 1971, we took off together to the jungles of South America to look for, we didn't know what exactly, something that we were convinced, well, with our experiences with DMT, we were convinced that the motive for going to South America, we were, one of the problems with DMT is it's so short in duration that you can barely begin to grasp what's happening by the time it's over. And so all you come back with, or which is good enough, but you come back with a sense of astonishment, just had an incredible experience, but you can't bring a lot of content back beyond that. And so we were interested in finding a orally active form of DMT. DMT is not orally active. We thought if we could find an orally active form of DMT, then we could spend more time in that place and kind of get our sea legs for trying to figure out what was going. And we were working under the hypothesis, maybe that's too formal a word to use here. It wasn't really testable hypothesis, but our idea was that these things really were portals to other dimensions, that we could essentially go to someplace else, and DMT opened up those realms. So again, this was not about a spiritual quest. We approached this almost like engineers. We thought of this as our ticket to hyperspace, if you want to call it that. And so we read about, at the time, 1971, the importance of the admixture plants in ayahuasca. And, ayahuasca is an orally active form of DMT. The one component of the vine contains beta-carboline alkaloids, the vine itself, and then these admixture plants contain DMT. And you brew them together and they're orally active. But the beta-carbolines inhibit breakdown of DMT, which is why if you can eat DMT or make tea out of DMT containing plants all day, but if you don't have the beta-carbolines, then it won't have an effect. So but we didn't know about that. It was not really understood at that time that ayahuasca was that was the mechanism of its action. That came later. We stumbled on a paper by Schultes called Virola as an orally active hallucinogen. That was the title of the paper, one of his Botanical Museum leaflet publications. And we jumped all over that. We thought, aha, this is exactly what we're looking for. And Virola, as you may know, it's a genus of trees in the nutmeg family, the Myristicaceae, and Virola is used in the form of snuffs by many tribes in the Amazon. The sap of the tree is very high in DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. So many groups in the Amazon make snuffs out of it because to get around that oral inactivity problem. But a couple of them, particularly the Watoto, made an oral preparation out of Virola. That's why it was interesting to us. And it was interesting enough that we thought, aha, this is the secret. We have to go for this thing to see if we can, penetrate to other dimensions. So we pretty much dropped everything. I mean, my brother at that time had been on the lam from Interpol for 2 years, hanging out in Indonesia and Japan, trying to lie low after a certain hash bust in 1969, which we don't need to go into. But I was a student. I was an undergraduate. Anyway, I dropped out of school temporarily and went down with Terrence and some other people to this place called La Churrera in the Colombian Amazonas. And why did we go to La Churrera? That was the ancestral home of the Watoto, and they were the people that had this secret, which we thought of, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, really, but from the standpoint of alchemy and so on, we thought we were in the quest of the secret. And we actually called ourselves, that's the origin of the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. It was my brother and myself and 3 of our traveling companions, all equally enthusiastic about psychedelics, equally deluded probably about the quest. But anyway, that was our intrepid band that decided to go to La Churrera in the spring of 1971. And when we got to La Churrera, well, we had met an anthropologist who was studying the Watoto in a village some distance from La Churrera that we passed through on the way to La Churrera. I mean, we had been told in Bogota that he was there and we would likely encounter him, and we did encounter him. And when he found out that we were looking for Ukuhe, well, in the first place, he was completely appalled that we'd showed up at all, because we were pretty wild looking. I mean, we looked like we just stepped out of Haight-Ashbury, which we really had. We were far more colorful than the Watoto. I mean, we had long linen. We wore white linen clothes and had beards down to our waists, and bells and beads, and we were a colorful bunch, shall we say. And we just show up on this poor man's doorstep, or hut step, I should place, at this village called El Encanto. Of course, in those days, you couldn't call ahead. You couldn't send a text or anything. So we just show up, and I'm sure we really ruined his day just to see these crazy people from San Francisco show up. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, we said, well, hey, Doc, tell us where we can get this ukulele, and that really set him off. And he said, you can't just go into these villages and start talking about this. This is their main shamanic magic thing. This is their true secret, and they will not be happy that you are interested in it, or even that you know about it. They'll probably kill you. He was a little bit excitable, probably because he chewed coca constantly. So he was always a little bit excitable. But we said, well, okay, we'll be cool. We won't just go in there and start asking about it. We'll be discreet. And so we went on to lunch.